fair elections. Canada has peaceful, orderly changes of government from time to time. Canada has a robust regime of civil rights and individual rights and protections of basic human liberties. Canada basically meets all of the criteria of a functioning democracy. I'm scraping some of the names off. I often see them do this on the Wired ones. Is Canada bigger than the USA? I suppose it depends a little bit on what you mean by bigger. Canada is geographically larger than the United States. This is something that Canadians are taught to learn as a point of national pride. But in terms of population, Canada is much, much smaller than the United States. Canada is usually described as being about a tenth of the size of the US. So if we think of Canada as having roughly 30 million people, the United States has roughly 300 million people. Both countries are larger than that, but that tends to be the ratio that I think most Canadians think of when we think of the comparative size of the two countries. This one is peeling pretty badly. Is Canada a state? So Canada is not a state if by state we mean a state of the USA, which is, I assume, what most people Googling this particular question are seeking to answer. Canada is very close economically and politically to the United States, very close culturally as well, but Canada is a sovereign country that exercises full political independence from the USA. Canada is a state in the sense of being a nation state, in the sense that all nations of the world are often officially classified as being a state. More academic types will refer to the Canadian state as a kind of synonym for the Canadian country, and particularly its sort of government. So in that sense, Canada is a state. All right, let's look at the second one now, which is, what is Canada? So let's see what we got here. What is Canada's national sport? So people, of course, often think of Canada's national sport as being hockey. This has led to a popular kind of rebuttal fact that you hear people often spout, which is that Canada's national sport is not, contrary to popular belief, hockey, but it is in fact lacrosse. And this is the kind of thing that people who want to sound clever will often, bring up. But in reality, Canada has two national sports. Hockey has been declared by Parliament to be the national winter sport, and lacrosse has been declared by Parliament to be the national summer sport. So Canada does not have a national sport, but rather two. I ripped off too much of this label, but I anticipated this happening, so I printed a backup one. So it is supposed to say, what is Canada FPT? FPT means federal provincial transfer. This is kind of Canadian bureaucratic speak for payments that sort of Ottawa, the federal government, transfers to the provincial governments for various reasons. A portion of taxes collected by the federal government and then distributed to the provinces in order to shore up their social programs in various ways. I understand that this is a line that sometimes appears when you get a tax rebate or other money from the government on a regular basis, and I suppose people are sometimes confused by that acronym, which is why folks are Googling to find out what it means. What is Canada known for? Canada is certainly one of the more famous countries in the world, I would think. Maybe I'm just biased as a Canadian. I feel Canada is known for its incredible natural beauty. It is known for being a country of enormous geography with a great deal of diversity in terms of its natural landscape. The great Canadian prairies and great Canadian forests and mountains and waterfalls and beautiful coastlines and beaches and all of this sort of thing. Canada is known for having incredible diversity of wildlife, a number of rather exotic animals, moose and beavers and Arctic wolves and polar bears and this sort of thing. Canadians are known for having sort of being a good-natured, well-dispositioned, polite people. We can dispute how accurate that is, but that is certainly something that Canada is known for. Canada is perhaps known for some of its indigenous art, like totem poles and carvings of the Aboriginal people, particularly on the Pacific coast and in the far north. So Canada is known for a lot of things. What is Canada Place? Well,
This is Canada Place.
it is a convention center here in Vancouver, known for its very iconic sail-shaped roof. These days, it's not used for as much as it used to because Vancouver had the Olympics in 2010, and we built a much bigger, grander convention center next door, and I feel that one is used a bit more. But walking around Canada Place is still a very popular tourist destination. All right, now let us do the Does Canada board. Does Canada have nukes? So Canada does not currently have nukes. Whether Canada had nukes in the past depends a little bit on your definition of what it means to have nukes, I suppose. There were American nuclear weapons stationed in Canada from the 1960s to the early 1980s as part of a sort of arrangement between Canada and the US for continental defense during the Cold War. The use of nuclear weapons from Canadian soil had to be authorized by both America and Canada, so it was kind of a joint program, you could say. The weapons were not developed in Canada. They were basically American-made weapons that were stationed in Canada. So in that sense, you could say that Canada never had its own sort of independent nuclear arsenal. The use of nuclear weapons in Canada was dependent on American assent. This was always a very controversial program. It was controversial when the weapons first came to Canada, and it remained controversial until the old man Pierre Elliott Trudeau made it a priority to remove nuclear weapons from Canadian soil, which he did in his final term as Prime Minister. Does Canada have freedom of speech? This is another question that is easy to be cynical about, but I think by any objective standard, and certainly any relative standard, we would have to say yes, Canada does have freedom of speech. You know, there is a constitutionally protected right to freedom of expression in the Canadian Constitution. You know, this is one of the great hallmarks of Canadian democracy, the fact that Canada is a country with, you know, a robust free press and, you know, unregulated internet and all of this sort of thing. Canada perhaps has less free speech than the United States because the right to free expression in the Canadian Constitution, like all rights in the Canadian Constitution, is not an absolute right. The Canadian Constitution contains language that says that all rights can be subject to reasonable limits, and the Canadian courts have interpreted reasonable limits on free speech in a rather broad way. Perhaps most infamously, if you're from a certain political persuasion, the existence of hate speech laws in Canada, you know, the idea that certain forms of speech targeting sort of identifiable minority groups can in fact be criminalized in this country. And, you know, there's, of course, limits on free speech in terms of copyright infringement and plagiarism and sort of things like that. Does Canada have a constitution? Well, as we just alluded to in the previous answer, Canada does have a constitution. Canada's constitution is a little weird. In fact, I think I made a whole video with this very title. The Canadian Constitution is often sort of imagined as existing in two discrete parts. There is the first half, which is what used to be called the British North America Act of 1867. It's now called the Constitution Act of 1867. This is the sort of bundle of British imperial laws that dictate how Canada's system of government is supposed to work. And then you have the second half of the Constitution, which is the Constitution Act of 1982, which contains perhaps the most famous part of the Canadian Constitution, which is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a new part of the Canadian Constitution that was added by the old man Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the early 1980s. And it sort of spells out the human and civil rights of each individual Canadian citizen, as well as clarifying some of the finer details of how the Canadian political system works. Does Canada have a president? Canada does not have a president. Canada has a prime minister. The Prime Minister is the head of the Canadian government. Although that doesn't really sort of have to be seen as a binary, because of course there are lots of countries that have presidents and prime ministers. In fact, I think the majority of countries are set up that way. In many cases, the prime minister is the person who actually runs the government, and the president is a sort of ceremonial figure. Canada is one of a very small group of parliamentary democracies that does not operate under that system. Instead, the sort of symbolic figure in the Canadian government is the Governor General, who represents the British monarch, who is recognized as the head of the state of Canada. And if Canada was to ever separate from the British monarchy, the thinking is that at that